The river was rising. On one bank stood the greatest army the ancient world had ever seen, battle-hardened, undefeated, led by a man who genuinely believed he was the son of a god. On the other bank, something that stopped even them cold. 200 war elephants, each one weighing 5 tons, armored in iron plates, carrying archers and spearmen on their backs, and specifically trained to do one thing. Alexander the Great had conquered Persia. He had swallowed Egypt whole. He had marched his army to the edge of the known world, and every single time he had won. But on the banks of the Hydaspes River in 326 BC, for the first time in his entire life, Alexander was afraid. Not afraid enough to stop, never that, but afraid enough to do something he had never done before: hesitate. What happened over the next 48 hours would become the bloodiest, most brutal, most heartbreaking victory of his entire career. And buried inside that story is a detail so dark, so human, that almost every history book quietly leaves it out. Welcome. If you're new here, this channel is where history stops being a textbook and starts being the thriller it always was. We're going back to 326 BC, northwestern India, a region the Greeks called Punjab, the land of 5 rivers. Alexander has already been marching for 8 years. His army left Macedonia in 334 BC with roughly 40,000 men. By now, they've crossed desert-scaled mountain ranges in winter and fought enemies that would have ended any other army twice over. And yet here they are, still marching, still winning. But here's the thing most people don't know: by the time Alexander reached the Hydaspes River, his men were done, mentally broken, homesick. Some hadn't seen their families in nearly a decade. The army that stood on that riverbank was exhausted in a way that no victory could fix. Alexander knew it, he just refused to accept it. Now standing across the Hydaspes River was King Porus, an Indian king, tall, fearless, and in possession of something Alexander had never faced in open battle before. The river itself was a problem. It was monsoon season. The Hydaspes was swole fast and deadly. Crossing it under elephant fire wasn't a military tactic, it was a suicide note. If you want more stories like this, battles that changed the world, decisions made in the dark that shaped everything after, make sure you're subscribed. We post every week, and trust me, what's coming next month is something else entirely. But right now, let's go back to that riverbank. To understand what made Hydaspes different, you have to understand who Alexander was by this point in his life. He was 29 years old, let that sit for a moment. 29, and he had already conquered more of the known world than any human being in history. But conquest does something to a person, it hollows things out. Alexander had been drinking heavily for years. By 326 BC, historians debate the full extent, but multiple ancient sources confirm it was a problem. He had killed his closest friend Clatus in a drunken rage just 2 years earlier. He genuinely believed, or told himself he believed, that he was divine, the son of Zeus, beyond ordinary human limits. His generals were worried, his men were breaking. And then there was Bucephalus. Bucephalus was Alexander's horse, not just any horse, the horse. Alexander had tamed him as a boy of 12 when no one else could. They had ridden together across Persia, Egypt, Central Asia, and beyond. Bucephalus was old, by now 30 years old, which for a war horse was ancient. But Alexander refused to replace him. Some historians believe that Alexander brought Bucephalus to India because he could not imagine going to war without him. That detail matters, remember it. Here is a man that history has consistently underrated. Standing reportedly over 6 feet tall, enormous, by ancient standards, Porus was calm, strategic, and deeply intelligent. He had positioned his 200 war elephants at the front of his line precisely because he understood something crucial. Greek horses panicked around elephants, the smell, the sound. The sheer scale of them, a cavalry charge, Alexander's most devastating weapon, would collapse the moment it hit that elephant line. Porus had essentially built a living wall, designed to neutralize Alexander's greatest strength. For weeks, Alexander camped on his side of the river. He staged fake crossing attempts, marching troops to the bank, then pulling them back over and over until Porus's army stopped responding to the alarm. He was conditioning them, training them to ignore the warning signs. And then, on a stormy night while monsoon rain hammered the river and thunder swallowed every sound, it was the dead of night, a moonless stormy night chosen deliberately. Alexander took roughly 11,000 of his best men, cavalry and elite infantry, and slipped upstream away from Porus's main camp. They crossed using boats and inflated animal skin rafts. The river was violent. Men were swept off in the dark. Nobody spoke above a whisper. On the other side, Alexander didn't wait for dawn. He formed his cavalry and pushed south directly toward Porus's flank. But Porus was not caught entirely off guard. He sent his son with a cavalry force to intercept. Alexander shattered them. Porus's son died in that skirmish, his firstborn, killed in what was meant to be a delaying action. That is a detail the ancient sources mention almost in passing. A father losing his son before the main battle even began. Porus received the news, and then he did something extraordinary. Porus reformed his entire army and marched out to meet Alexander on a patch of open sandy ground, better terrain for his elephants than the muddy riverbank. The formation he deployed was like nothing Alexander had faced. 200 elephants spaced roughly 30 meters apart, forming a living front line. Behind them, infantry on the flanks, cavalry. Ancient sources, specifically Arrian, describe the sound of the elephants as something that physically stopped the Macedonian advance for a moment. Not just the horses panicking, the men froze. Soldiers who had fought Persians, Bactrians, and Scythians veterans, they stopped. That's how terrifying 200 war elephants look in person. Alexander had anticipated this. His cavalry swung to the flanks in a coordinated pincer movement. He refused to charge the elephant line directly. Instead, he drew the Indian cavalry out and destroyed it first, cutting off Porus's mobile units. This is the part most documentaries skip over, quickly don't. The Macedonian infantry used a brutal, specific tactic against war elephants. They went for the feet and the trunks. With long-bladed swords and sarissas, their massive 18-foot pikes, they hacked at the elephants' most sensitive extremities. Wounded elephants did not retreat, they went mad. Trumpeting in agony, several elephants turned and charged back through their own lines, crushing Indian soldiers, trampling their own infantry, spreading chaos through Porus's formation. Ancient accounts describe the sound as deafening. The screaming of men and animals mixed together until you couldn't tell them apart. The elephant, the weapon designed to destroy Alexander, became the weapon that helped destroy Porus. But here's where the story takes a turn that almost nobody talks about. Because after the battle was won, after Porus was captured, and the field was quiet, something happened to Alexander that no military victory could fix. And it would end his conquest forever. The Battle of Hydaspes was won technically decisively. But the numbers were staggering. Ancient sources estimate thousands of Macedonian casualties, unusually high for an Alexander victory. Porus lost somewhere between 12,000 and 23,000 men, depending on the source. And the elephants, most of them were dead, or captured wounded animals, wandered the battlefield for hours. And then a groom found Bucephalus, Alexander's horse, his companion of 17 years. Bucephalus had been wounded during the battle, some sources say by Indian arrow. Others suggest simply the exhaustion of the crossing, and the charge finally broke him. He died on the banks of the Hydaspes River. Alexander, the man who had executed enemies without blinking, who had burned cities, who had convinced himself he was a god, Alexander wept. He founded a city on the spot and named it Bucephala in honor of a horse. That tells you something about who he actually was, underneath all of it. Alexander treated Porus with remarkable respect. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus reportedly said, "Like a king." And Alexander, who could have enslaved him, executed him, humiliated him, made him a governor instead. He gave Porus back his kingdom and more. Why? Historians debate this. Some say Alexander genuinely respected Porus's courage. Some say it was calculated politics, maybe it was both. Maybe after watching Porus fight on, after losing his son, Alexander saw something in him that he recognized. But none of that matters to what happened next. Alexander wanted to keep going. He always wanted to keep going east, into the heart of India, toward what he believed was the edge of the world. For the first time in the entire campaign, his soldiers refused to march. On the banks of the Hydaspes River, shortly after Hydaspes, the Macedonian army sat down and would not get up. His generals told him it was over. His men were broken. They wanted to go home. Alexander retreated to his tent for 3 days, refusing to come out, hoping they would change their minds. They didn't. He emerged and announced the march was over. By ancient accounts, he wept again, not from sadness this time, from something harder to name. The man who had never been stopped had been stopped, not by Porus, not by war elephants, not by a swollen river in monsoon season, by the quiet, exhausted refusal of his own men. Alexander never recovered psychologically from this moment. Within 3 years, he was dead in Babylon at age 32. The official cause is debated: fever poisoning, or simply a body that had taken more than any human body could take. Greatest conqueror in history, dead before 33.